Hello and welcome to the SPA London Regional Conference. My name is Chris Matthews. I'm the London SPA Regional Officer and I'm chairing each of our three panels today. We're very happy this is a sellout event. Thanks to everyone for joining us. This is our third and final panel of the day and it's about moving beyond print and diversifying your skills. I'm going to introduce our panelists. We'll have a conversation around the subject and there'll be time for questions at the end. If you feel comfortable, you can raise your hand digitally on Zoom and we'll unmute you to ask your question, or you can write it in the chat and we'll read it out. Just so everyone is aware, the panels are being recorded as well as live streamed to the SPA YouTube channel. And just finally, the Spark 21 London Awards will be announced via Twitter this evening. So do go and follow SPA Journalism if you haven't already and turn on your tweet notifications. Right, so our panelists are Adepitan is a TV presenter, journalist, author, and former international Paralympic wheelchair basketball medalist with a wealth of broadcasting experience. He regularly goes undercover for Channel 4 dispatches and has travelled the world for Foreign Affairs series Unreported World and the BBC Travel Show. He has hosted countless sporting events, including co-hosting the 2012 Paralympic Games and the 2014 Sochi Winter Games for Channel 4. He is also a co-host on Children in Need and has published a series of children's books surrounding his childhood of growing up in East London in the 80s, coming from a minority background and living with a disability. James Toney is the managing editor at Beat Media Group, comprising of industry-leading news agencies Sportsbeat, Storybeat and Kennedy News and Media. He is responsible for all training at News Associates, the UK's #1 NCTJ journalism school, and he is an award-winning journalist and author of Sports Journalism, The Inside Track. His work has been published in publications around the world, and he is a regular contributor to BBC and Sky News, as well as a commentator on sporting issues on TV and radio. And Jenny Kleeman is a journalist, broadcaster, and documentary maker who has travelled the world finding extraordinary characters to turn into film, print, and audio. She writes for The Guardian, The Times, The Sunday Times, and Tortoise. She has reported for BBC One Panorama, Channel 4 Dispatches, and News Tonight on HBO, as well as making 13 films from across the globe for Channel 4's Unreported World. She is the host of the Immaculate Deception podcast and the breakfast show on Times Radio, the Weekend Breakfast Show. Her first book, Sex, Robots and Vegan Meat, was published in 2020. So guys, there you go. Welcome, thank you for coming to chat to us. Can we start by telling us how each of you ended up doing what you're doing now, and what do you believe are the most important skills for the work you do? Jenny, should we start with you?
I do a lot of things. Ooh.
Sorry.
Oh, Jenny, you go first.
Well, I do a lot of things all at the same time. This morning I presented 4 hours of live radio, but I'm promoting this book that I've written that's coming out in paperback in April. I write long form articles. I quite often make podcasts that go with the articles. So it's not something you kind of wake up as a student and think, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have this portfolio career. But the fact is, for me, being a journalist has meant that you have to diversify. You have to have a lot of different ways of sustaining yourself. So I took a very kind of meandering path, but I guess the one thing that kind of goes through everything that I do is that I think of myself as a reporter and a writer. I'm someone who deals with words, and even when I made television programs, I felt like I was in charge of the words and the interviews, whereas other people were in charge of the visuals. So there's I don't think you can ever set out to have the kind of career that I've got. I don't think any of us would say that we had a vision of where we wanted to be and we got there. It doesn't work that way at all. But for me, the kind of key thing is, and the thing that I wish I had known as a student, is that if you are someone who is reliable, who's trustworthy, who has ideas, good ideas, and is a nice person to be around, you are like gold dust. There are very few people who have all of those qualities. You might not believe it, but it's true, and you will go very far if you have those qualities. So for me, the one thread that goes through everything that I do is that I do original journalism. I do all of my own stuff. I write all of my own scripts always. I'm finding my own interviewees. I feel very fortunate that my kind of background was in current affairs television, which has very high standards. It's regulated by Ofcom, which isn't necessarily the case. Well, it isn't the case with newspapers, but I carry the same standards everywhere of doing journalism, thinking that the reporting that I do could end up being used in a criminal trial, could end up being really heavily scrutinized. So I try and do things in a very professional way. That was quite a kind of long waffling answer for someone who's meant to be a very succinct writer. But there you go. There is only a meandering path to where I am now, I would say.
That was fantastic. Thank you. James, do you want to tell us a bit about you?
Yeah, first thing I should say is I had a deadline for 4 o'clock, which I'm now 9 minutes over. So the first tip is always hit your deadline, which I've just failed to do spectacularly. So, yeah, I think I always wanted to be a journalist, apart from a very brief flirtation about 4 years old, wanting to be a dustman. I always wanted to be a journalist. Didn't quite know what sort of journalist I wanted to be. And to be honest, still don't. And I think that's one of the great things about the job. And even if you have an idea of where you want to take your career, don't be a slave to it, because I've done lots of different things. I've worked in news, I've worked in sport. I've taken a strange career path from someone who desperately wanted to edit a national newspaper, and now no, I won't. But I love the job I do, and I love its variety, and I'm quite fortunate to do a job that challenges me in lots of different ways. So I guess my only piece of advice I always tell everyone, which is say yes to everything. Even when you think you can't achieve something, just say yes. I remember really early in my career being asked to be a showbiz journalist. I had the square root of bugger all interest in being a showbiz journalist, but I thought, well, can say yes. You can always go and find someone who knows a bit about it and ask them, and they can tell you what to do. I wasn't a very good one, but sometimes you need to do something to realize you're not good at it. So my advice to everyone is, everyone on this call might have an ambition with what they want to be. They want to be a comment writer at The Guardian. They want to be the political editor of Sky News. They want to do long form pieces for the New York Times. That's great, but don't nail your colours to that mast too soon, because your career can take you in lots of different directions, and you've got to be able to do a bit of everything in journalism now. But most importantly, say yes, and then work out how afterwards.
Brilliant. And Adi?
Yeah, I got into TV in a very roundabout fashion. I think it definitely wasn't my first choice. I was an athlete. I got into sport, and sport was what I thought was going to be my thing, and it was going to be my career path. My parents, incidentally, were never into me being into sport, and they always wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer or some sort of profession that they thought was acceptable. And we sort of came to a happy agreement that the medium, the place that we could go to is journalism. I always said to them, well, yeah, I'm never going to be academic enough to be a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or any of those. And I found them all quite boring. And I thought, well, journalism, that sounds good. So I threw that out there, and I thought that would distract them whilst whilst they thought I was trying to be a journalist. I sneakily went out to become a basketball player. And they say, when are you going to be a journalist? I'm like, no, I've just got to get this basketball thing out of the way first. But the sport actually surprisingly, it opened doors for me to get into TV. And you're seeing it more and more. I mean, it's been happening for a while, where athletes, former footballers, former athletes, then get into TV and into print journalism. I sort of came into it kicking and screaming. Actually, I just thought, I didn't think I was going to be right for it. I didn't think I was academic enough. I didn't think I had the technical skills to be a journalist. So I went into children's TV, and even that was kicking and screaming. And my first thing, and when you say yes to everything, James, I've said yes to a lot of things, and it's got me on the back of an elephant, trekking tigers in the middle of India, crawling up a volcano on my backside, and just doing all sorts of eating urchin gonads in Tasmania. So don't always say yes to everything. And what you also learn with TV media is the more distressed you are, the more crazy it looks, the more likely a camera is going to be in your face. But yeah, in terms of diversifying, I think it's really important. I think diversification of what you do is probably the theme of today. You know, it's what makes a journalist, what makes a TV presenter, or anyone wanting to get into the media sort of platform. It's what makes you who you are today. Because when I got into TV or when I got into media, it was mainly TV, radio, and print journalism. But now there are so many other mediums out there in terms of social media. You've got Facebook, you've got Instagram, you've got TikTok, you've got YouTube, and you have to be able to speak to as many people as possible throughout all of these platforms. And I think if you don't, it's going to be, you will become obsolete. I mean, it sounds pretty stark and drastic, but I think the way the modern world is consuming media, you have to start being able to diversify and open your mind and be able to use all of these different forms of media. If there was something I would say to myself in the early days, fortunately, which I think I did have, but I think it's a really important skill, and that is to be open-minded. It's to be absolutely never be closed off to anything. I think the most surprising avenues have led me to the most interesting things. So I think that is the key. There'll be stuff that you think, well, you know, maybe I'm not that interested in it, or maybe I don't think I'm going to be good enough to do it. I mean, one of the things I said yes to actually that actually worked out for me, but at the time I was thinking, oh, geez, why did I say yes to this? Was when for my very first unreported world, I said I could go to Cuba and present and do a report on a group of basketball players, but do it in Spanish. And I hadn't spoken Spanish for 20 years. I said yes. And when I went out there, it was a total mind meld. My brain was all over the place. But because I pushed myself and because I was open-minded, I think it opened doors for me to move into a different avenue of journalism that I never expected to go to. So be open-minded.
James, I've got a question for you. For someone leaving university with a degree in something other than journalism, are there any key skills budding journalists should be learning to get into the industry?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, you've got to have an enthusiasm for news. I think that's the first thing. You've got to be interested in the world around you. You know, I still find it staggering when people sometimes come to us, say they want to be a journalist, and then we start drilling down on how they consume their media, and they tell us, well, I read The Guardian and I watch BBC News, and we want a lot more than that. So it's sort of curiosity and a passion for journalism, and interest in it in all its forms, because there's a lot of great journalism, there's a lot of not so great journalism, but in all its forms. I think it's a seriously competitive industry, journalism, and you've got to tool yourself up to get ahead of the game. And I think there's no doubt that further qualifications are important. I think it's quite hard sometimes to break in without those further qualifications. Addy's obviously a great example of someone who has done that, coming from that fantastic sporting background. But I think it's absolutely worth looking at when you graduate, looking at things like the NCTJ, National Counselling for Training a Journalist diploma. I think you've just got to give yourself, there's a lot of people coming out, a lot of really good universities with degrees saying they want to be in the media or they want to be in journalism. And you've got to have a lot more than that to be able to make your mark.
Thanks. Yeah, that was really interesting. And Jenny, you've worked in several different areas, you know, print, radio, television, online. How difficult is it to jump from medium to medium?
I don't find it very difficult, although quite a lot of what I do involves very, very different skills. So, for example, the radio show that I do at the moment for the Times is a very newsy show. and it involves interviewing people for maybe 7 or 8 minutes a time. And quite often I have to rely on other people, on my producers, to have done the research for me, which I find very, very difficult because I'm used to being a journalist, finding my own interviewees and setting everything up. So that requires a different part of my brain. But the skill set is basically the same. I would say that being a journalist requires certain skills of being a good communicator, thinking about your audiences. A good interview is a good interview. I mean, I think the thing that all of these things have in common, and the thing that I wish I'd known when I was a student very much, is, so I was a very academic student. I did very well academically. I worked really hard in my degree and I did really well. And I think I kind of imagined that in life that you would arrive at some point, you know, you would get somewhere and all of a sudden opportunities would be provided for you, or you would get to some level of success where you wouldn't have to hustle so much anymore. And that was completely mistaken. You are always hustling. You're all, you know, no matter what level of success you're at, you're absolutely always hustling. You're always looking for opportunities. I mean, even now, I have done some things that seem very successful, and you know, journalists quite often give the impression of opportunities falling into their lap. They don't. You're always trying to make things happen, and you will never come to a place where people provide you with opportunities, no matter how well you've done at university, for example. So in each of the different fields, there has never been something where somebody has said to me, "Hey, Jenny, why don't you come along and make this podcast?" Or "Do you have any ideas for books?" Although it might kind of sound like that or seem like that. You have to be constantly ready whenever any opportunity arrives. And you also have to remember that there is no secret formula to any of these fields. What you need is ideas and confidence and a willingness to try it. And you know, you'll be told pretty quickly if the people you're working for think you can't do it. So you just have to try it and throw yourself into it.
And so, Adi, when you go out to like you said, you went out to Cuba, you're talking to the characters of your film. How do you first approach them in a way that's going to get them to tell them your story? And by the way, just hello to Justin Webb, who's joined us. Hi, Justin. I think we're going to be able to get you talking soon, but Adi, I'll ask you that question. We'll sort the sound.
There we are. I'm done. Nice to see you all. Sorry I'm a bit late.
That's all right. No worries at all. We're just having a chat about multimedia journalism, moving beyond print, lots of different skills, anything and everything, really. So I'll let Adi go on.
Yeah, I think you know, Jenny will know about this as well from your work on Unreported World, in terms of it's really it actually getting the trust of a contributor is probably the key and the most important part of any sort of any documentary where you are focusing on a character-based documentary. And I found, I was thrown in at the deep end when I started with, it was more out of my asking. It wasn't anybody else's fault. It was what I wanted, and that's how I like to do things, to be challenged. And when I started making documentaries like Unreported World and some of the Dispatches, I think what you soon realized is you have to get people in a state where they don't even realize or care that there's a camera there, so that they feel they can trust you to give you their story. And also you have to go in pretty humble, very humble, because you are in a privileged position where you are sharing or being allowed into some really, really personal stories. And sometimes I think one of the things we used to do is we would go in without the camera. We'd go in without a camera, maybe spend a day or two with, depending on how much time we had, with our contributor, just getting to know them and them getting to know you, and understanding that you're someone they can trust their story with, someone who's not going to let them down. And really that's it. And it's also just being honest with them, and having that curiosity that James has talked about, and being really interested. There's sometimes, I think what I'm fortunate in having is that before I got into TV, before I got into journalism, and I still find it weird to call myself a journalist because I didn't do all the, I don't feel worthy because I didn't go to university and all of that stuff. But I think what's really helped me is I had a life before TV. So I've had many experiences. I've known what it's like to be rock bottom. I've known what it's like to have the world against you, to be judged. I've known what it's like to be at the top. I've known I can come from various different angles. So when I speak to people, I kind of use that everyday experience that I have in order to try and get their story from them and get them comfortable. And so I would say what would really help if you want to get into this type of documentary making is to have a life, more than just TV, but to have a real life. Go out there, experience stuff, get messed up, do great stuff, do crazy stuff. But the more you have, the more it equips you to become a person that's empathetic, that can be caring, that can be trustworthy, but that can also use that journalist side of you to get the story out that you need.
And just following on from that kind of strain of thought, Justin, I'm going to ask this one to you. What do you think are the most important skills for someone starting out now as a journalist? You know, that they may be a student journalist, they don't know where they're going to end up. What are the most important skills, do you think?
Just to follow on from what Adi was saying, that I couldn't agree more. And in a sense, I come from a completely different background here. So I did do all the formal stuff, but I went to boarding school and then university and all the and BBC training. I mean, you couldn't be more kind of in the kind of obvious conventional way of getting into all of this. And yet, actually, to be honest, the skills are pretty much the same. And it's not about necessarily your identity. There's sometimes that helps, of course, but actually it's about how genuine you are as a person, about talking to people. And I freely admit in my life, I kind of changed in my 20s and 30s. I went to the first Gulf War when I was 30 or so, and then and Bosnia and places like that, and saw, really, I had a relatively privileged upbringing, albeit a bit eccentric, but I'd never really, to actually see how people live in places that are affected by conflict, and to take that into your mind, not necessarily then to report on it or to use it that day, that month, that year, but to have it in here as a kind of sense of how it is that people behave when they're under pressure, and how important it is for them, all the things that are important for them. Trust, Adi mentioned, that's incredibly important. It's people need to feel in you, and you need genuinely to bring them a kind of an ability to be persuasive, but also be honest, and not to throw away just for a kind of second or two for a clip of an interview that trust. And that's such an important part of gaining people's confidence, but also more than that, actually gaining your own self-belief, your own sort of self-confidence in doing things, sort of growing yourself as a person while you're doing it. And why it was interesting to listen to Adi talking about TV and how sometimes it's good not to have the camera. I've spent quite a lot of my career in radio where you don't have the camera, and actually that's why I prefer radio in many respects, because it does give you that ability. I started in Northern Ireland still in the Troubles. I'm that old, back in the kind of mid 1980s, and you'd go to some god awful scene where something awful had happened, with just your, in those days it was a reel-to-reel tape recorder, a Ewer, that you kind of carry on your microphone. But people would then chat to you, literally forget that it's on. And those sorts of things, you can do with other mediums that aren't telly. And frankly, the camera's also got an awful lot smaller, because in the old days, when you went for telly, you'd have a sound man who was known affectionately as the lump on a string, because they were attached to they were usually rather portly gentlemen of a certain age, and they were attached to the cameraman by a kind of tube, because there was no such thing as any kind of Wi-Fi connection. And you'd bring these characters into a room and it would be just nightmarish, and they'd literally knock the furniture over. And now, of course, it's much slicker, and Addy and others know much more about it than I do, how it works now. So the camera's less in your face, but still that business of not being in people's face, whether it's the kit, whether it's the team that you're with, whether it's you yourself, it's drawing people out rather than thrusting towards them. I think all of that's incredibly important to remember when you're starting out, and frankly, to remember, all your career through.
I don't know whether you guys felt this at all, but I, especially some of the documentaries I made for Unreported World, I felt an incredible sense of responsibility that, for these people whose stories haven't been put out there, to take their story and get it out there in the right way, because for a lot of them, it's life and death in certain situations. And also it's so easy for us to stroll in, almost observe their story, be this guy from the West who can write this and say, oh, this is really great, this is dramatic, and get this, and we got this on camera. But then we get to go home and come to our lovely houses, and they will still continually be living this life. So I felt that if I'm going to have the privilege to come home to my luxury place back in the UK, that I've got to get their story right. I've got to make sure that I get there, give them a voice in the right way. So I always try to be humble, but carry this sense of responsibility to make sure I get their story across.
I'd absolutely agree with that. And I wanted to add it because we're talking also about diversifying beyond print, that you can make a big difference by choosing to tell your story in different media. And as Justin was saying, some are much more intrusive than others, and you can tell a completely different story. For example, with audio, I made this podcast recently about this Dutch fertility doctor who impregnated his patients with his own sperm without their knowledge or consent. And I interviewed these children who are all the children of this fertility doctor. And I would not have got the interviews that I got if I had been filming them, or certainly the women who had undergone this. It's extremely harrowing. And so part of that responsibility, you always have to be aware of that, and of the power dynamic that you have as somebody, as Addy says, who's kind of parachuted in. You have to tell their story responsibly. You have to keep in touch with them afterwards and make sure that they're okay when it's going out and afterwards. But also you have to think about how you tell their story, and perhaps the way that you can do it most justice might not necessarily be on camera, and perhaps you can bring it to life in other ways, in a much more meaningful way.
Yeah, and what do you wish you would what do you wish you had known when you were starting out in the industry? James, we come to you. James, can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, you came to me. Sorry, I missed you. What do I wish I'd known when I started out? I think I thought that all journalists were going to be stabbing you in the back at all times. Whatever you did, you were going to be just up against the wall. And I didn't realize one of the things I love about this job, it's a fantastic team sport. There is almost nothing better than being in a news organization when a big story breaks and seeing how they all come together. Everyone knows their role, everyone delivers their job. There might be someone whose name's on that front page, someone who's leading that bulletin. Behind them sits this amazing team of people, incredibly driven, incredibly passionate. And I love teams, and journalism is a really great team sport. So when I got into journalism, I thought everyone was going to have it in for me. I mean, I also say that, in journalism, you meet a lot of arseholes, and 9 times out of 10, they're other journalists. So I don't know what, but I do think that, so I wish I'd known that. And I just wish I'd thought that like I said at the start, I wish I'd said yes to a few more things at the start. I wish I'd listened to a few less people and trusted my instincts a little bit more. Especially when you're starting out, you can afford a little misstep. You can afford maybe taking the wrong job or going down. At the time, it will seem like the biggest mistake you've ever made in your entire life, and it's all gone wrong. But actually, I think probably I overthought it too much when I was starting out. So yeah, trust your instincts, which is not a bad thing to do as a journalist as well. I was watching the fantastic program that Sky News do from the front line, and Stuart Ramsey was talking a lot about when he's on that front line, he trusts his instincts. He's been there so often that he really, that's the thing, that's his compass that guides him on his when he's making those incredible reports from hotspots around the world. So yeah, that would be my advice.
And what about you, Justin? What would you say to someone starting out?
Yeah, I think following that, I think don't be tempted to become as cynical as some of the older hands either are or pretend to be. And I think that's a trap for a lot of young journalists. You kind of get into this way, and particularly in a busy, if you're working for a large organization like the BBC, there'll be a few people who are frankly a bit knackered and a bit past it and are still there. It's odd, isn't it, how that continues to happen even in these straitened times. But that is the way that any large organization works. And there's a bit of I felt intimidated, I think, when I was younger by people who kind of seen it all and done it all, and had that kind of sense of putting you down. And I think, there's probably an extent to which that isn't now quite as fashionable as it was when I was starting out. But I think there is still a sort of tendency of you to put yourself down and exactly to not to kind of go with your gut. And I think it's, I think without being kind of over arrogant about it when you're young, I think you do bring something that frankly people who've been doing for quite a long time don't bring, and you've got to remember that whatever they tell you.
And nowadays as well, it's much easier to email someone or text someone you want to interview or get information from than just to pick up the phone. I mean, do you think it still matters to phone people directly, actually talk to people? Jenny, should we come to you?
Absolutely. You can totally tell when you read a piece. You can totally tell when somebody has just done it over email. And maybe the students watching this are not like me, but I think it took until I was really quite old, until I was about 26, 27, before I really didn't dread ringing people up on the phone, and before I felt confident enough to say, hello, this is me, you should talk to me. But that is, part of what has made me the journalist that I am is that I'm so out of the loop. I'm the opposite of Justin in a way, in that I've always been freelance. I've never had really the goodwill of the organisation I work for to get people to talk to me. I don't get sent press releases, so I don't get PR people saying, here's a nice fully fledged story. I've always just had to approach people in a very kind of lo-fi way. And as much as you might not really want to make a cold call or might not want to disturb people, write yourself 2 bullet points of what you're going to say. Hello, this is Jenny Kleeman. I'm doing this story. I really think you'd be a fantastic person to speak to. You can start initially with an email, but you've got to interview people, talking to them in real time. Interviews over email, I've never read good interviews over email. And in fact, when people ask to interview me over email, I just really don't want to do it because I don't want to write people's articles for them. I mean, other people might disagree with me, but I find that if you want a real kind of texture, really interesting interview, you have to be doing it in real time.
Yeah, and Adi, how about you? Do you sort of agree with all that? Is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I certainly, I definitely agree with what Jenny's saying, because I've been interviewed by email and I've also been interviewed face to face. I just don't get how anyone can get anything from an email interview. I mean, when someone does an email interview, it feels to me like, yeah, that's just going to be some throwaway piece that's at the back of the paper that no one's going to read, because you can't read unless the person who's giving you the answers really spends time and then they write it for you, and I felt like I've written many people's articles for them by giving them like this massive long email. I've been doing a bit of print journalism, and I did a piece for Enable magazine, and I did a piece about. I didn't know what I was going to write about. They just said they wanted me to do some pieces for them over the course of a year, and a friend of mine who is a wheelchair, he services wheelchairs, he repairs wheelchairs. He plays in my basketball team, and he hadn't been able to work because of lockdown. And when the lockdown was eased last year, I called him because my chair was in desperate need of being serviced. And he was outside my house. We had to social distance, and I was chatting to him. And it was when I was chatting to him that the piece came to my head, because he suddenly told me about how difficult life had been for him as a disabled person during lockdown. You know, and I was meant to be asking him to sort out my tires, but he told me about how he hadn't spoken to anyone for 28 days, how, you know, he was in depression, how not being able to, you know, go out and meet people, how not being able to play basketball was really affecting him, and, you know, not being able to contact friends. His parents lived in Spain. And it wasn't just the fact that he was talking to me. Is the fact that I could look him in the eyes and I can feel his pain, and I could transfer that pain to my writing. I could get that across. And I phoned him up afterwards, and then had a 2-hour phone call with him afterwards, and heard in his voice. And I would have got none of that from an email, none of that. So I just think it's so important that face-to-face contact. And actually, that's my currency. That's what I deal in, is face-to-face contact. And it's come from my sporting background, funny enough. You know, when you play basketball, especially disability sports, you're surrounded by people with huge egos, right, from different backgrounds, who have had incredible stories. And they don't suffer fools gladly. And you might be in a pressure situation where you've got to, I know you've got 5 minutes on the clock, you're losing, you're playing a big game, you've got the crowd against you, and you've got to get your information and communicate really, really quickly. So for me, I was able to use those skills, you know, of understanding people and communicating really quickly under pressure situations. And so I think that's that whole thing of using every aspect of your life. It doesn't just have to be sport. It could be in anything. We've all been in pressure situations, and it's just about remembering that and using that when you do your interviews.
Right, I'm going to open up the conversation now to everyone watching on Zoom at home. So you can raise your hand digitally on Zoom, or put a question in the chat, and we'll read that out. In the meantime, I'll let everyone have a think on some questions, and I've got one instead. So how important is it to build up contacts, and how do you go about doing that? Justin, I'll go to you.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to be a bit organized about it, and I'm not, frankly. I haven't really done it well, I confess. And that's one of the advantages of going to broadcasting. You've got other people who do it as well, or do it instead, frankly. But I actually, it is one of the things I wish. So going back to what you wish you did when you were young, I wish I'd been much more assiduous about doing things. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was in a coach crash when I was at university. So it was about 1981, so an awful long time ago, before the internet was invented, before anything was invented, really. And I wanted to get hold of all the people who were in the crash. Guy was killed in it. It was in Yugoslavia. The other day, and I just, of course, I've been really genuinely starting from scratch, and I actually haven't managed to find anyone much. And it's things like, in this day and age, of course, it's much easier to find people, but it's still much better if you're able to keep those people who are not easy to find, because of course the ones who are not easy to find are often the most interesting. So I do think kind of being organized, there's no other way of doing it, being really organized to make sure whenever you've talked to someone that you keep and you annotate it properly. But I say that not from someone who has done it, frankly, through their lives, but someone who wishes they had.
James, What do you think? Do you
Yeah,
agree?
I mean, contacts are such an important currency, I think, to a lot of journalists, and everyone you meet is a potential contact, and the only time that you'll know it is sometimes after the event. So, I think that it's funny. I know some of the best journalists I've worked with could not string a sentence together, but they had the most amazing contacts. So when a story broke, they were on the phone, they could call the right person, they could get something out of them. They put their thoughts down and emailed it to the subs desk, who made it look great. But it's a weird thing. People think, oh, surely you have to be able to write. But actually, I've worked with some journalists with some pretty dodgy English who have been some amazing story getters. And I think everyone you meet is a potential contact. I tell this story to our trainees, but I'm from the Isle of Wight. So when you're from the Isle of Wight, you're into two things. You're either into drugs or sailing, and I was into sailing. So the newspaper I was working at, there was this sailor who was sailing around the world. But I'd actually had a chance to interview her a little bit beforehand. So she'd written into the newspaper and said, I'm sailing around Britain in what amounted to like a bathtub. So the news editor sent me down there to interview this person. I interviewed her, and I thought, I'm never going to ever meet you ever again. It was just going to be a story that just ended up as a sidebar somewhere, probably not even published. Didn't take her telephone number, didn't take her email address. And then about 2 or 3 years later, I'm standing on the quayside in La Rochelle waiting for Ellen MacArthur to come back from sailing around the world, having just achieved this amazing success in the Vendée Globe race. And sometimes in journalism, you need an angle, an in. So when there's suddenly a really hot person who's all over the news, you could call that person up and say, do you remember me? I was the first person that interviewed you. And that just might be the reason for them to speak to you rather than the other 499 people alongside you. But yeah, I was just waiting there, waving my notebook at Ellen MacArthur. It's a nice story, but I didn't get a better story than the journalist stood next to me. In fact, the person who also interviewed me with her on that first time ended up ghostwriting her book, and I ended up buying her book. So, everyone's a contact, and you've got this really weird thing to say to people, can I have your telephone number? I mean, it's like it's an alien thing to ask a stranger for a telephone number. But like you were just saying a moment ago about face-to-face contact, especially as a lot of people on this call are on student media, it's easy to hide behind a phone call. It's easy to hide behind an email. And actually, COVID is making it much harder to gain access to people. But getting them on a Zoom, if you can, so you can see them face-to-face, it makes a lot of sense. And also, if you want someone's contact and they give you their email, they could ignore your email all day long. Really, really push for someone's contact number. Contacts are incredibly important to journalists. And so I know people who've got jobs on the basis of their contacts because they're able to find stories that people can't.
Just on the kind of the practical sense of keeping contacts, are you ever filled with a kind of sense of dread that you might just lose your contacts book?
Did you say that was to me?
Or to anyone.
The first thing you should look for in a fire is your contacts book before you look around for the children or the dog. They're so important to you, and I'm sure you can back them up and put them in different places. But the thing is, the only time when you lose someone's contact, that will be the time you really need it.
Yeah. I think you have to be really careful about how you keep your contacts. I'm just reaching for the ones that I can reach here, but I have about 600 of these that I've had throughout my entire career. I do everything in hard copy, and I realise now what a dinosaur it makes me. My co-host on Times Radio is young. He's 27. He's very, very smart. He has everything in his phone, everybody's number in his phone, every politician, every press officer, everything, and it's all immediately there. So whilst I might have all these contacts, I have to remember, when was it? It was around that time, and actually look through it all. And maybe that says more about me than it does about him in terms of how disorganized I am.
You could still lose your phone. I've had loads of contacts, and I've lost my phone. I dropped it in the sea, and when you need those contacts immediately, I know you've got the cloud, it's still hard to get it. So I think having it on paper and having that hard copy is great. I'm bad for it because I throw nothing away, because I get notes or people giving me their contacts in all sorts of places, and I'll write it and I'll keep it in my pocket, and I've just got scraps of paper everywhere. So I'm the opposite of you, Justin. I keep absolutely everything, but I just don't. And I'm the opposite of you, Jenny, because I'm not organised to put it those nice books. I've just got paper.
Can I give one quick tip as well when asking someone for a telephone number? Incentivize them to give it to you. So if you just ask them and you say, can I have your telephone number? They're probably going to tell you no. But if you say, look, when I come back and I edit this tape or I write this story, if I need to check anything with you, what's the best number for me to call you on? Suddenly they're thinking, that's absolutely in my interest to give that journalist my contact number because I don't want them to get anything wrong. So it can be a bit strange. And certainly if you're working in sometimes sport, you might find people are hiding behind agents. Oh, here's my agents. You want their number, not their agent's number. But yeah, you can try to find a way to incentivize people to give you your telephone number.
There's another aspect to it, which is how often you keep in contact with your contacts, even when there's no story going on. And I'm in the weird position working for the BBC, where so many people want kind of the inside take on who's doing what to whom. That there are quite a few national newspaper journalists who have me as a contact, and it's quite interesting actually being the kind of subject of it, because there's a guy who rang me yesterday. He's just fishing around for stuff, but he's very friendly, and he doesn't screw me over. So if I tell him something about the BBC, which of course I never would because I'm not allowed to, but if I were to do such a thing, then it wouldn't be in the print with my name on it. And I know in other words, you build up a trust over time. And I know, it's quite interesting to be used in that way because you can see what works and what doesn't. And when people are genuinely interested in the subject, like, the future of the media or something quite seriously, and want to talk to people who are practitioners of it, and people who are just kind of just having it on and hoping to get a kind of a quick, cheap story. So it is worth not only keeping those, I was just so impressed seeing Jenny's books and a little intimidated as well, I have to say, but it's not just having all those names, it's also at least a few of them where you just ring occasionally and say what's going on in your world and make it plain that that's why you're doing it. You're just interested.
I tell you who's I've learned to cherish the contacts whose contacts I've learned to cherish is fixers. When you work as a documentary maker, having an international fixer, when you got someone who knows the language, who knows the layout, who knows the political layout in that country, is so important. And keeping, as you say, Justin, keeping in contact with them. If the shit hits the fan in that country, you might not necessarily be on that story, but just send them an email or a text to say what's going on. So you've always got them in the loop, because I found fixers make and break the films that I've done. It doesn't matter how good the story is. If your fixer is rubbish and you're lost, and they can put you in some really awkward and dangerous positions. So the fixer is the person who gets everything sorted, who's your conduit in the country when you're in that foreign country, to opening doors and getting you places. And when you have a good fixer, it's like gold dust. So, you keep that, you cherish that contact.
And what do you think is the most difficult part of your job, Adi?
Difficult part of my job. My job is probably convincing the bosses to what's the word? To give me the thumbs up on the show. You're going with ideas, trying to get an idea across and getting them to say, yeah, you're not bonkers. I mean, I did the Africa with Adepitan series, which was a 4-part series on Africa. I was pitching that for the best part of 20 years. I mean, it doesn't get much more difficult than that. I was getting told that, no one wants to hear about Africa. It's too worthy, or it's a tough story. How are you going to make that work over 4 episodes? So yeah, I think getting the story over the line is partly difficult for me. But then I suppose I've also, last year I was making a series on climate change, which comes out later this year. And that took us the best part of 18 months to make, mainly because of COVID. And I think logistics can be a huge problem when you're doing travel journalism, getting out to places and finding doors being closed to you, or, missing flights, or getting misinformation. I was in Cameroon making a story about football agents or fake football agents who would they would basically go into villages, tell kids or tell their families that they could get them, you know, a contract playing for Man United or Inter Milan or big team if they gave them, their family gave them like $10,000, and they would trick the families into giving this money, and then they would just dump the kids in the middle of nowhere. And so it was really hard to get the correct information from people, and it meant that we ended up obviously these people don't want to show themselves, and it meant that we ended up traveling all over Cameroon, and our story took, you know, 2 weeks longer to get because of that. So, you know, getting the right information, and I mean, which comes from contacts as well, is really difficult, and getting the story over the line, or getting the story to be getting it to be okayed by the bosses is difficult as well.
And we've got a question from Marino at Raw News, and I think this is more aimed at Jenny and Justin. So for those who have branched out into audio content such as radio and podcasts, what's your advice for growing that sort of audience alongside the more traditional print and website content? Justin, should we come to you first?
Well, I mean, the big thing, it seems to be, it's obviously such a crowded world, isn't it? And it's a crowded world of content, often very good content, but often what's the word? Quite long-winded, quite kind of self-referential. I listen to stuff sometimes and I think, you know, you could do with a really good editor. And I think, you know, I was judging some student stuff the other day, and a lot of it was really good, but it just all needed sharpening, bringing down. It's all too much chat, too much kind of slightly kind of trying to be too clever. And I think the thing with appealing to people is have something really, one thing that's really ear-catching in what you're doing, and something a little bit different from all the chatter and the opinion, actually, something that just brings it alive. And I know that's easier said than done, but I think the thing you've always got to be thinking in yourself when you're trying to appeal to a wider audience is, you know, why should they be listening? What is it that separates out what I'm putting out there from a load of other stuff that there is? And it seems to me that's the thing. It's the sharpness of it that really pulls people in and provides something that others don't. I got a pal called Owen Bennett Jones, who's an ancient old, he's actually as old as I am, and who did a brilliant set of podcasts few years ago about the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, and you'd think, well, that's not kind of massively promising topic, frankly, that's going to put, but I mean, just people around the world were gripped because he had a few interesting new details about what had happened to her, but just the most kind of sparse script and stuff that he was introducing. And it's that way of, you know, we're not all going to be doing those podcasts about, you know, dramatic world events, but it's the way of saying, look, I've got this, and you're not going to hear it elsewhere, and sticking that right at the top rather than a load of waffle, which I think is sometimes the temptation.
Jenny, do you want to add anything to?
I would just absolutely agree with that. It's a very, very crowded market, and there are a lot of people, particularly now in lockdown, who feel like, I know what I'll do. I'll get a mic and I'll talk to some interesting people. And it doesn't work that way. It really doesn't work that way. The best podcast, also, there's nothing you have to realize, which is that the way that podcasting works, there's certain things, certainly on Apple Podcasts, they get promoted through complicated algorithms. There are marketing teams behind them. They think about the artwork, they think about the name, everything is, you know, the way of standing out in that market is very difficult. And I would say you need to think about access. You need to think about what exciting worlds can you get inside, because audio, as I was saying before with my podcast, audio enabled me to really get in quite intimately inside a very interesting world. And also, I totally agree with Justin. You have to have a bit of restraint and think, you know, why is this interesting? If you are doing an interviews podcast, which are simpler to do, because I have done a true crime investigative podcast, it required so much work, so much work. It would be so much easier if I was recording as live all the time. But then again, it was a much easier thing to sell. Like, this is me. Here is a fascinating story, well told, that I thought about from the beginning. I was a guest on Joe Rogan's podcast in September, which was quite an experience. Joe Rogan has a massive audience, incredibly devoted to him, and he is very, very brilliant at what he does. And when he was interviewing me about my book, he said to me, you should really have a podcast. You should do it. I'll help you do it. And I thought, oh, this is a great opportunity. Joe Rogan, the king of podcasts, says I should have a podcast. And you know what? I haven't launched one. And I probably should, but I can't really, I can't think of anything beyond, here I am, and aren't I interesting? And I'm going to find some interesting people to chat to. I need to get beyond that and get a kind of shape to it that really feels like me. Otherwise, you are just going to drown in this absolute super podcast that has emerged ever since the pandemic.
Brilliant. Well, I'm afraid that we've come to the end of the session, but it's been a wonderful and insightful discussion. And thank you to all our panelists for sharing your experiences, your views. And thanks to everyone watching at home as well. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, please do tweet us, tell us about it at SPA Journalism on Twitter. That's it from our panels today, but we'll be announcing the SPA London Award winners this evening. So keep an eye out on SPA's Twitter, turn the notifications on. Thank you all very much and good luck for tonight.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys.